Today we have this event which is going to roughly run for 1 hour 30 minutes, and I would like to take you through the an overall picture of and the framing of this event, and then I would invite the speakers one by one. So to start with, let me give an overall picture of this event today. As I mentioned, this title is again how to synergize the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And my name is Nandakumar Janardhanan. I am speaking from Japan now, and I belong to the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies, where I work as a research manager in the climate. This event today will focus on synergetic government actions to meet Paris Agreement goals and this 2030 agenda. And as part of this, we have 4 different presentations which are made by 4 excellent panelists. And these presentations will give you an overall picture about 2 specific aspects. First is actually an energy policy tracker and fossil fuel subsidies tracker. And the first presentation is going to be made by Joachim Roth from IISD. He will talk about the trends from EPT, the Energy Policy Tracker, which IISD has been developing with several other institutions across the world, and thankfully IGES also had the opportunity to be part of this initiative. And in this presentation, Joachim will actually sort of give an overall picture about how this entire initiative of Energy Policy Tracker has shaped up, and kind of trends that has been witnessed during this COVID-19 period, and all those information has been very well captured in this tracker. And this is one of the most incredible results for anyone who would actually like to see public policy and COVID responses during this past 2 years. And Joachim would actually focus on the 2 guiding questions. What are the trends and lessons emerging from EPT regarding government responses in the energy sector during the pandemic, and how can this data support higher climate ambition as part of this Paris Agreement goals? And the second, in this context of COVID-19 recovery and the current energy price crisis, what are some of the energy policies that would have the most important social impacts, and what are the implications for implementing these measures in different countries and contexts? And from this presentation, we'll move to the next one, which will be presented by Dr. Satoshi Kojima, who will actually speak on the Japan's efforts at municipal level to promote renewable energy and circular economy. And he'll focus on the key guiding question, which will focus on how can efforts at the municipal level in Japan encourage renewable energy and circular economy, help meet the 2030 SDG agenda and Paris goals. The third presentation will be focusing on the fossil fuel subsidy tracker. And the third presentation is done by Lourdes Sanchez from IISD, actually be focusing on reporting, monitoring, and evaluating fossil fuel subsidies. And as part of this, the guiding question will be why is it particularly important for countries to monitor, report, reform fossil fuel subsidies, and what are some of those trends that emerge from this fossil fuel subsidy tracker? And the last presentation of this event will be done by Claire Fortevin from UNEP. She'll be giving us an overall picture about SDG indicator 12C.1. And in that work, the presentation will be around what progress has been made by governments in supporting fossil fuel subsidies as part of SDG 12C.1. And before inviting the speakers, I would like to introduce the speakers to all of you. First is Joachim Roth. Joachim Roth is a policy analyst from IISD's energy team, and the global subsidies. He's also been working with global subsidies initiative. His recent work has focused on green recovery, natural gas alternatives in the global south, and engaging advocates on national oil company environmental fiscal reform in Nordic countries and fiscal transitions away from fossil fuels in those countries. He has also provided research and communication support on just energy transition for all phase out in emerging and developing countries. The second speaker, Satoshi Kojima, is a program director of the Kansai Research Center and a principal researcher at the Climate and Energy Division at the Institute for Global Environmental Strategies. He has joined IGES in 2005 and he has conducted various quantitative policy impact assessment using computable generative models, and he has led research projects on sustainable development policy, including sustainable resource management and sustainable ecosystem use. And Dr. Kojima has also been contributing to from the IGES, and he has a PhD. He is a PhD. One of his leading policy researchers guiding the IGES climate and energy team's research. The third speaker is Lourdes Sanchez. She's a policy advisor and lead Indonesia working in IISD's energy program. Her research focuses on analysis of energy subsidies, evaluation and design of sustainable energy policies, and on developing communication strategies for energy subsidy reforms. She has worked in projects in different countries, including Mexico, Indonesia, China, and India. The last presentation will be done by Claire Portugal. She's an economist at UNEP, where she works for the fiscal policy team in the economy division. Her work focuses on green fiscal policies and in particular on harmful subsidies reform and role of public finance in leveraging financing information. So with this, I would like to invite, I've stopped my presentation here, and I would like to invite Joachim to go ahead with his presentation. And once again, sorry to keep you all waiting. Joachim, over to you.
Thank you, Nanda Kumar, and thanks everyone for joining. Yes, apologies for the technical issues and the delay in time. So I'll go right into it, and I'll share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone is able to see my presentation here. Perfect. So today I'll be presenting on the key findings from the Energy Policy Tracker and how has the data from the Energy Policy Tracker contribute to the narrative for green recovery, how it can increase climate ambition, but also some of our more recent work on the inequality and poverty dashboard and how it is in line with SDG 10 on reducing inequalities. So maybe first of all, what is the Energy Policy Tracker? So the Energy Policy Tracker, EPT, is a tracking tool that was developed during the COVID pandemic period. It was launched in July 2020, and it works as a network. There were 6 core partners in the EPT, sort of the decision-making body of the EPT that founded the EPT, and then there are contributing partners which track government response measures in the energy sector. So both for energy production and consumption in 38 countries and 8 multilateral development banks. And so essentially the EPT is really looking at public response measures. So not looking at private sector contributions, but it's looking at a wide range of measures in different sectors within the energy sector. So mobility, buildings, resource extraction and power generation, and a wide range of measures as well, which makes it a bit unique in this way, where it looks at budgetary transfers, but also equity injections, loan guarantees, and other types of measures. And the way that the EPT works is that it essentially classified these measures during the pandemic period based on their energy type. So whether they supported more fossil fuel energy, clean energy, and what we call other energy. So other energy in this case would be more, for example, what we classify as nuclear, or when there's a mixed support from governments to fossil and clean energy, or hydrogen of unspecified origin, for example. And then fossil and clean, of course, fossil is for fossil fuel energy, and clean is for different types of clean energy, such as renewables, like solar and wind, but also energy efficiency, for example. And also to note that in the EPT, there is a conditionality element. So we thought it was important to note that there are policies supporting fossil fuels, but there are emission reduction targets. So these are more what we call fossil conditional measures. And also not all clean energy measures will have obviously no environmental impact. So in this case, there are clean conditional measures as well. If we think of support for certain types of biofuels, for example, or large hydropower, there can be definitely some environmental impacts. So what do we see from some of the overview of the public money commitments from the EPT? So of course, these numbers can change. So here we've assessed the whole 2020 to 21 period. And what we've seen is that generally speaking, there's been more funding for fossil fuel energy, about 41.2% of all public money commitments, than for clean energy, whether it's been slightly less than $500 billion USD committed. And it's interesting to note from the graph that obviously the recovery spending has been quite unequal between countries, a point I'll emphasize a bit later in the presentation. And while we can see that some countries we've recorded more spending towards clean energy, there isn't a country where there's a perfectly clean track record in terms of contributing to a green recovery. So this is also an important finding from our analysis. So if we look a little bit more granularly at what the data tells us, what we can see in terms of the public money commitments over time is that generally there's been a greening of the recovery from 2021 to 2020. So this is something interesting to note. So for example, the clean energy spending increased on average from about 24% from the beginning of 2020 to 37% at the end of 2021. And we can tie this to actually a small number of large recovery packages or support measures. So for example, the US Infrastructure Investment Act, there's obviously been the Green Deal in Europe, but there's also a number of other very large recovery packages. So these largely explain this shift in green recovery spending. But what we see is that the share of support for clean energy has somewhat stagnated since the beginning of 2021. So there are some improvements, and it's important to note that, but there's still a lot of room to, based on the data we see, to improve climate ambition and to maintain that improved commitment in the post-pandemic period. So what do we see per sector? And I think this is an important graph in terms of coming at sectoral analysis and more detailed conclusions. So we see that half of the public money commitments went to the mobility sector, and it's a bit split here in between support to clean energy and fossil fuels. So of course here there was a lot of support to airline bailouts, which suffered a lot during the pandemic. But there was also support to EVs and a number of measures for charging stations or incentives for consumers. But however, what we know is that some sectors, there's much less funding going to them based on our analysis. So for example, for energy efficiency in buildings, we found that that only corresponds to about 5% of all the public money commitments we've analyzed. And we think there's a bit of a missed opportunity here, again, because these are measures that can obviously reduce emissions, but also create jobs. And if we think in the context of the energy price crisis, that can also reduce energy costs for households if well implemented. And then interestingly, when we look at the types of policies implemented, there's also this analysis that we find that there's been a lot of support on certain types of measures, like budgetary transfers, for example, but not so much on other measures such as fossil fuel subsidy reform or carbon pricing. And these are, I think, these will be discussed a little bit more, I think, by the other panelists today, but these are important measures because they can raise revenue, contributing to higher climate ambition. While they can be sensitive to put in place, they also do not necessarily increase public deficits. So again, interesting measures to consider as well. So how has the EPT data concretely supported climate ambition, and what has it been used for? So the EPT data has been quite useful, I think, with other recovery trackers and shaping this call for building back better and the narrative that governments need to contribute to a green recovery. It's been covered in a lot of media stories internationally in 60 countries. It's also supported the work of the UN Secretary General, but also other organizations such as UNEP, the World Bank, and others. But what we really see from the graph below is that the impact of the EPT has really increased when we're able to leverage this data as part of research that we have with some of our contributing partners, but also as part of advocacy efforts. So the data in itself, of course, won't have an impact if we don't have influencing strategies in place to ensure that we can analyze the data and therefore best communicate how countries should have a higher climate ambition in place. So, for example, some of the work we've done is with other recovery trackers, where we've published a joint statement at the last COP, where we came up with common principles for an equitable and just green recovery. So this is an effective way to show that we have a common voice in shaping the narrative for a higher climate ambition. So some key takeaways in relation to SDG 13 and for higher climate ambition. The first one is that there's really a need to align with the 1.5 trajectory as much as possible. We know this from the IISD net zero scenario, IPCC's latest report. The clock is ticking, and from the EPT data, we see still there's quite a lot of support in certain cases for fossil fuel production, and in some cases even without any environmental conditionalities in place. So this cannot be compatible with the 1.5 degree scenario, and from our analysis, there's a lot of room to improve that. The second, and this just doesn't mean just divesting from coal, for example, it's more widely about support to fossil fuels in general. The second point is about investing in low-hanging fruit. So I mentioned here 2 points earlier about there's still room to improve investments in energy efficiency in buildings from our data analysis, but also in certain types of measures like fossil fuel subsidy reform and carbon pricing, which still remain untapped as well. And finally, and a really important point, I think, and this is not something that just came out from our analysis, but more from our work with other recovery trackers, such as the Global Recovery Observatory, is that recovery spending per capita is about 200 times lower in low-income economies than higher-income economies. So clearly, there's a need for more international cooperation, climate finance, and climate. All countries are not starting on the same footing in this sense. So we can see this in the data. So there needs to be more international cooperation to ensure higher climate ambition. So let me just discuss a little bit briefly with you some of our latest research on the social impacts of energy policies that we launched in April 22. We developed an inequality and poverty dashboard. It's a joint project between IISD and ODI. And so our research question that we were trying to answer with this project is, what are some of the social impacts that energy policies can have? And this is, I think, an important question. We see this with the current crisis with high inflation or high energy prices, that there are impacts on consumers, depending on what types of energy decisions governments make. And also, we know that if there isn't a consideration of social impacts, there can be a backlash in terms of less support for the energy transition and therefore delaying the energy transition. We've seen a number of movements, such as the Yellow Vest movement in France, and a number of other protests like the fuel price protests in Ecuador and so on. So this is why we went into this analysis, and what we did is that we assessed, we grouped energy policies. So we assessed about 1,000 the energy policies in the EPT, and we assessed them by grouping them into policy categories. So, for example, these policy categories include support to airline bailouts or for retrofits in social housing. And then within each of these categories, you have a number of energy policies that correspond to this category. And then what we did is that we developed a conceptual framework to guide our literature review to better assess what kinds of inequality and poverty impacts we were trying to measure for these different categories. So we focused specifically on income inequality and poverty and monetary and multidimensional poverty. And so we looked at how different energy policies can impact energy commodity prices, whether in some cases there can be localized job impacts or spatial impacts, whether over time impacts might vary, for example. This is a first stepping stone analysis. There's still quite a lot that could be done in this field. We have not done country-specific assessments, so it's more a high-level assessment. So there's definitely more research that could be done in this area. But interestingly, what we note from our analysis, some of the key findings, is that for the policies implemented during the pandemic, we see that there's about 60% of them that are likely to decrease poverty, but in contrast, only 11% are likely to decrease inequality, based on our literature review and a conceptual framework. So I think this is interesting because it may reflect the fact that during the pandemic, there was a lot of focus on immediate relief to households and industries, but less perhaps attention on how some of these policies may exacerbate inequality and who actually benefits from these policies. So what we found, for example, is that the same type of energy policy can have different impacts on poverty and inequality. If you think of retrofits or subsidies for EVs, these tend to be policies that will be more labor intensive to create jobs, so you can have a poverty reducing effect. But also from the literature, we find that often without complementary social policies, higher income groups tend to benefit the most from some of these subsidies. So there's this double effect that needs to be considered here. But that doesn't mean that even if some energy policies can have detrimental social impacts, that these impacts cannot be completely alleviated. There's a number of design and elements and complementary social policies that can be put in place. I'll just mention three here in the interest of time. The first one would be recycling revenues from carbon and energy taxes. These recycling of revenues can, through cash transfers or other means, can ensure that consumers do not face, for example, higher energy costs without other forms of compensation. There can be inclusion of local communities in clean energy projects, so there's less opposition to some of these projects, a better sense of who benefits from the projects. And also, when we talk about trainings, these can be targeted, obviously, for groups that have perhaps lower skills, if we talk about retrofits for buildings, for example. So there's just a number of ways to really make all these clean energy policies more socially progressive and more acceptable. So just to conclude here in terms of key takeaways, one of the first one maybe in line with my previous point is that we find that there's a number of these policies supporting fossil fuel production without any environmental safeguards. While there may be some, the rationale in the short term in terms of increasing energy security and supply, often in the medium run, the gains will be more localized for certain workers, for example, but there's a high risk of stranding even for workers in the medium and long run, and higher air pollution can impact lower income groups. So these policies should really, really be carefully considered, and we do not find that they would have necessarily these positive social impacts. The second point is that, again, we see only a minority of policies where there's what we call triple win or win-win policies, where there's positive impacts on poverty and inequality reduction and benefit to the climate. So this includes mostly retrofits for social housing. So here it'd be interesting to scale up some of these support measures and see how this could be done in the different countries. And finally, maybe the two last points, one of them I mentioned already, is that there's a need to focus more on what are the inequality impacts of some energy policies, not just the poverty impacts. And especially, I think it'd be interesting to have this conversation in the current context of the energy price crisis. And then the last point is that there's a lot of complementary policies that we can design so to alleviate some of the negative social impacts energy policies could have. So essentially, there's no reason to delay the energy transition because of some of these impacts. So I'll stop here, and you can find more information about the Energy Policy Tracker and the research we've done at these different links. And I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has. Thank you. I'll pass it back to you, Nanda Kumar.
Thank you, Joachim, for making this very informative presentation and especially explaining about this energy policy tracker and also this poverty dashboard. I'm sure this very useful, extremely useful information and a database that is available for the public use, and I feel like many of those in the audience also will benefit from accessing these resources. And I have two quick announcements to all of you. And so first of all, I'm sorry that I did not mention that, but the event is being recorded, and so the recording is already going on. And the second point is that is my request to all the participants, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A option below, and so that we will be able to post that to the speakers. Now, let me invite the second speaker for this event today, that is Dr. Satoshi Kojima from IGES. Dr. Kojima is going to speak, give us a picture on this case study of Japan and efforts at the municipal level to promote renewable energy and circular economy. So over to you, Dr. Kojima.
Thank you, Nandakumar. Thank you, everybody. Sorry, I have a throat problem today, so I apologize my bad voice today. But anyway, let's start my presentation. So my presentation is about case study Japan. Currently, Japan try to meet decarbonization target and SDGs targets along with decentralization and revitalization of the local economy. So I'd like to introduce you this Japan's effort currently. So background problem is that, as you may know, Japan faces a serious problem of declining local economy with declining birth rate and then aging population. In a sense, this is in many countries, it's a common problem, but Japan is a kind of pioneer of this like aging society. So, so Japan's effort might be very interesting for other countries who face similar problem. And then so this graph shows the population has the share, so over 65 years old and then less younger than 64 years old. So the red part is the like aged population. So as you can see, from 1950 to so currently we are now 2020. So already the percentage of population age 65 or older is around 30% now, and then this is anticipated to increase to more than 35% in 2050. So very rapidly aging population is ongoing, and then as you can see, the total population is decreasing quite substantially. So this is the current Japan situation. On the other hand, the extreme concentration in Greater Tokyo area as well as other very big cities like Osaka area, Nagoya areas are ongoing. So this graph shows how the population share in these big city area are increasing. So this purple part is a Greater Tokyo's population. And then, as I mentioned, even the total population of Japan is now declining, but still the population living in Greater Tokyo area is increasing, as well as in Greater Nagoya area and Greater Osaka area. And then the population in like other areas, many rural areas are declining substantially. So this is a current situation. And then there is a quite interesting study conducted by Professor Hiroi of Kyoto University in collaboration with Hitachi company, who provided the AI technology to conduct an AI-based simulation to project the Japanese future. And then, so this research focused on 8 topics: population, and second is finance, and third is regions, fourth is environmental resources, fifth employment, sixth income disparity, seventh health, and then eighth happiness. And for these 8 topics, experts identified 149 social drivers and causal relationship models among them were developed. And then using AI, around 20,000 simulations between 2018 and 2052 were conducted. And then interesting key findings is among various drivers, it was found that the most important policy decision is to select either urban centralized future or local decentralized future. And this decision must be made around the latter half of the 2020s. But another very, important message of this study is this local decentralized future is desirable for sustainability and for like happier society. However, if local economy is not properly functioned, there are risks of unsustainable situation environmentally or financially after latter half of 2030s. So to avoid such risks, continuous policy effort to improve local economy circulation is necessary through environmental taxation, local employment policy, promotion of local renewable energy, and provision of better public transportation, cultural and moral support to strengthen communities, and social security to promote local asset accumulation. So these are very important messages from this study. And then, so this study was very influential. And then currently, the Japanese government has adopted one important policy to promote decarbonization transition in Japan through a regional decarbonization roadmap, which was adopted last year in June 2021. And then, so this regional decarbonization roadmap presents the process and concrete measures for regional decarbonization, which will also be a growth strategy for the region, with a particular focus on initiatives and measures to be implemented by 2030. And then, according to this roadmap, at least 100 decarbonized regions, like municipalities or even a part of municipalities, will be created by 2030. Then, so these 100 decarbonized regions are kind of pioneering areas, and then it is expected to, have repercussion or like influence to surrounding area to promote similar effort. Specifically, appropriate measures such as renewable energy, energy conservation, and use of electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid vehicle or fuel cell vehicles, and the use of carbon neutral fuels will be combined according to regional characteristics and the climate. And then, according to this roadmap, there are like 8 priority measures, and then the 3 basic policy measures are stipulated. So 8 priority measures. So first one is self-consumption solar power generation, including roof-mounted solar power generation. And second one is location of renewable energy sources that coexist with the local community and benefit the local community. And third one is through energy conservation and procurement of electricity from renewable energy sources in public facilities and then other commercial buildings, and induce zero energy buildings conservation at the time of renewable and then renewal and then the renovation. And fourth one is improve the energy saving performance of homes and buildings, like zero energy buildings or zero energy homes. And the fifth one is zero carbon drive, which is a combination of renewable energy based electricity combined with shift to electric vehicle or plug-in hybrid or fuel cell vehicles. The sixth one is a transition to a circular economy through advancement of resource recycling. And seventh is decarbonized urban development through compact city plus better network, etc. And last one is improvement of productivity and sustainability of food, agriculture, forestry, and fishery industries in like rural economy. And then to back up these 8 priority measures, following 3 basic policy measures are proposed. First one is establishment of regional implementation systems and active support from the government. The second one is lifestyle innovation through green and digital technologies. And third one is innovation of like rules to make the whole society decarbonized, like advanced carbon pricing, etc. So this is currently the Japanese government policy to promote decarbonization and also to achieve SDGs together with revitalization of local economy, and then make sustainability of land, the territory better. And then, so this regional decarbonization roadmap policy is actually backed up by another important environmental policy, which was stipulated in several years ago as a part of basic environmental plan of Japanese government, which is a circulating and ecological sphere concept. So this concept, so this concept is, this concept underpins the regional decarbonization roadmap policies. So according to this circulating and ecological sphere concept, so importance is, so as this diagram shows, starting from bottom, so the first important part is interaction and human exchange between rural area and urban. So rural area will provide natural capital, and then urban area will produce capital as well as human capital. And then so based on this active interaction of rural and urban area, and then utilizing rural natural capital, then reduce, reuse, recycle policy for resource circulation is combined, and then also decarbonization policies like smart grid and renewable energy, energy saving, etc. will combine. Then finally, so this will connect to global community with exchange of people or information and technology about circulating ecological sphere to promote SDGs, including Paris Agreement target. So this is another basic policy principle, environmental policy principle of Japanese government now. And then this is the last slide. So this is just provide some example of this circular ecological sphere concept in one area near Osaka area, but this Hokusetsu area itself is a rural area, just very near to Osaka mega city. And then currently, so there are this circulating and ecological sphere activities in this area. So based on forest conservation to improve the maintenance of natural forest, and then producing and sales of charcoal, and then so undergrowth cutting to maintain forest, and then so this will provide biomass utilization, and then so biomass would be utilized for heat as well as electricity generation, and then based on this the energy provision from mountain area will be transferred to urban area, nearby urban area. And then also the urban area will have with activated like local tourism in the mountain area. So they can expect tourists from urban areas, and then also can provide like environmental education based on some facilities in mountain area. And then also another issue is like local food production for local consumption. So rural areas and then the urban area will be connected through this as a producer and a consumer network. And then including a citizen farm in urban area. So we'll increase like food security in this area. So this is a kind of example of circulating and ecological sphere concept. So again, the point is, so as I mentioned, so currently Japan's efforts to achieve Paris Agreement target as well as SDGs are closely connected to decentralization effort to improve the population, better population distribution, and then local economy revitalization with addressing the problem of aging society. And then another important element is this like circulating economy between rural area and urban area, utilizing their strongness of each region. So this is Japan's approach to simultaneously achieve Paris Agreement target and SDG target. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kojima, for making this presentation on the case study and also highlighting about CES, a very important and interesting concept that is getting a lot of attention in Japan. Now, we have some questions, but let me save that questions for later for the Q&A session. And in the interest of time, let me move to the next speaker. The next speaker is Lourdes, and she's going to speak to us on reporting, monitoring, and evaluating fossil fuel subsidies. And my request to the next two speakers is if you could actually save 1 or 2 minutes, that will help us actually have some questions at the last Q&A session. Over to you, Lourdes.
Thank you very much. I'm just gonna start sharing my screen. I hope you can see the presentation. Now I'm trying to put in is it working in the presenter modus? Okay, perfect.
Yes, perfect.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, great. So basically, well, I'm gonna have a little bit of different presentation because I'm gonna focus very much on, well, what are the advantages or what are the links rather of reporting fossil fuel subsidies and the, you know, the Paris Agreement or like a fight against climate change. So just to start saying that, well, I think in this audience, everybody's convinced that there's a strong link between fossil fuel subsidies and climate change. So as we all know, the fossil fuel subsidies encourage use of excess use of fossil fuels. And we know that fossil fuels are a major cause of climate change. But at the same time, also by reducing, so when fossil fuel subsidies obviously artificially reduce the cost of fossil fuels. So that makes also that, you know, they become more competitive in an artificial way, I insist, than other sources which are more climate change friendly, like, for example, mostly renewables, but also other forms of energy that have much less impact on climate change. So that's why there's a strong link. And actually, well, research shows that actually reforming subsidies to fossil fuels can result in significant emission reductions. So the graph here that I'm showing in this slide is coming from a study we did at the IISD a couple of years ago. And basically, we're looking at 32 countries that together represent 77% of the global carbon dioxide emissions. And actually what we saw is like if these countries remove their subsidies to fossil fuels, by 2030, they can achieve just by removing these subsidies like around 6% reduction of CO2 equivalent emissions. But if that money that is saving, so in the end, subsidies are part of public budgets that could be devoted to something else. So if that money is partly devoted to energy efficiency and renewable energy, that percentage of emission reduction can get to almost 10%. And if on top a tax on fossil fuels is implemented, and again, we earmark part of these revenues to energy efficiency or renewables, we can reach up to 12% emission reductions. And again, this is just covering 32 countries, but there's evidence, at least from the point of view of modeling, that removing subsidies to fossil fuels and also taxing fossil fuels has a very, very strong positive impact on emission reductions. However, despite all these results, until last year in Glasgow, fossil fuel subsidies were not part of the Paris Agreement. So there was no statement or any kind of clause that was discussing about the phase out or removal. But that changed happily last year. So for the first time, COP26 Glasgow Climate Pact included an element on the reform of subsidies to fossil fuels. So this is the particular language that comes in there. So it's on the Article 4 on the mitigation. And then what we see there is that it's talking about the importance, or let's call in the parties actually to include accelerating efforts towards the phase down of unabated coal power and also the phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So now we know that it's part of the climate discussions. So what can we do actually? So there are a lot of opportunities to track progress on fossil fuel subsidies. So again, tracking progress is a very, very first step to know what countries have, what we have there, and also that will help us to define, will help countries to define concrete targets to phase out these subsidies as, it's included in the language of the Glasgow document. So within the climate world, there are several opportunities that can be used to do that. So first of all, there's the possibility to include fossil fuel subsidies and their reform in countries' NDCs. So we know that there are already around 15 countries, more or less, that have done it in the past. So they have included explicitly the reform or the phase out of subsidies to fossil fuels in their NDCs as part of their commitments to achieving the Paris Agreement. But there's a lot of room that many other countries can do as well. And as we've seen, it's a relatively easy win to although, well, of course, Joaquin was talking about the social impacts, but there's I mean, the impact it has on climate, on CO2 emission reduction is quite positive. Also, there's a global stock take that the discussions are starting to raise more and become more and more important. So fossil fuel subsidies could eventually also be included as part of the global stock take, again, to track progress and ambition on achieving the climate goals. And the last thing, well, there are also a lot of data there, and that's what I'm going to be talking about next, to ensure transparency and also facilitate targeting of fossil fuel subsidies. And I'm going to move to that again. Again, there are a lot of data on fossil fuel subsidies already there. And sometimes we hear that actually it's very complicated to measure subsidies to fossil fuels. There's no definition. Well, that could be the thing in the past, but that's not longer the case. So Claire is going to be talking about the SDG indicator 12.0.1 next. So I'm not going to get into that, but just want to say that there's a methodology linked to that. So there's a UN approved methodology actually to determine and define what fossil fuel subsidies are, and also to determine what types of fossil fuel subsidies are and how to measure them. So all this is actually aligned and comes from existing databases that have been existing there for a while now, because we have mostly the OECD, the IEA, and the IMF that have been providing data on fossil fuel subsidies, but also we have some other independent inventories done mostly by researchers or civil society, etc., of fossil fuel subsidies. And actually all of these already, they follow the same methodology, although they cover different aspects, as we will see later with the SDG indicator. But what is important is that data are there, and it just requires to understand what is there. And for that, actually, we have a tool that we at the IISD developed together with the OECD, is the fossil fuel subsidy tracker. The graph that you see there is coming from there, and actually that's the first ever integrated database on fossil fuel subsidies that considers the values from the OECD, from the IEA, and the IMF, and basically classifies them according to this methodology of the SDG indicator. So you can see the link there, fossil fuel subsidy tracker. So that's the you can go online, and basically there what you have is all data. You can download them in Excel and play with them. And again, it's done according to the different typologies that have been defined in this indicator methodology. You have also there a page with the methodology, so it explains what the data you're looking at and how to read the data. But overall, this is basically an approved source of data that's being sold together for the first time. And well, just to finalize my presentation, I just want to say that, I mean, actually transparency is going to become more and more important, especially considering the current oil prices. Because we see actually, if you look at the past, if we compare the level of fossil fuel subsidies, the global level of fossil fuel subsidies, if we compare them to the international price of oil, we see there's a very strong correlation. So we see here when prices started going down, so international oil prices started going down, fossil fuel subsidies followed very quickly. There was a peak, fossil fuel subsidies follow as well, then down again, and now we don't have yet the latest estimates for fossil fuel subsidies. So the latest we have is 2020. But we have data for international oil prices, and we see that they're going up. And we also know that there are different measures, as Joaquin was mentioning, the EPT. We know that there are more and more measures that are supporting fossil fuel subsidies in the past couple of years as prices have been going up. So that means that if we want to achieve the Paris Agreement targets, if we want to follow the Glasgow statements, it will be very important to understand what countries are doing and see how this trend continues. And again, set up concrete targets to reduce, to phase out subsidies, especially those that have least or that most negative impacts both on climate and also social impacts. So yeah, that's basically my key message for this presentation. So it's important to track, and it will be even more relevant as prices of international oil, in the markets are going up. That's all. Happy to answer to any question, and yeah, went a little bit fast in the interest of time, but again, happy to answer any question that might come after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lourdes, for presentation, especially highlighting especially answering the question, why is it particularly important for countries to monitor reform fossil fuel subsidies? Our presentation has been extremely interesting, and also so we'll see if there are any questions. And now let me move to the last speaker of this event today, Claire Portevin. She's going to speak to us on SDG indicator 12C.1, and she'll be looking at the progress in reporting and monitoring fossil fuel subsidies as part of SDG. So over to you, Claire, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. Hello, everyone. My name is Claire Portevin. Indeed, I work with UNEP under the fiscal policy team, and I will be telling you about the SDG indicator 12C.1. Let me just share my screen real quick. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I assume you can also, I'm going to assume you can also hear me well. Very well. I'll try to also not take too long. Again, in the interest of time, I will be focusing in this presentation not so much on the content of the indicator, but I'll speak mostly about the reporting process that was built around it and the progress that has been done in this regard. So before I move to the reporting process itself, although Lourdes actually just did that, I think it's always good to emphasize and remind us that the identification of subsidies and our capacity to gather accurate, comparable data on subsidies for fossil fuel is obviously the very first step towards a larger goal, which is the reform and the repurposing of the subsidies. But this being said, the measure of fossil fuel subsidies is very much a fundamental step if we want to be able to not only track progress, but also design policies that are both impactful and context-based. So to say a bit about the context in which this methodology was developed, again, Lourdes already touched a little bit upon this, but to say a bit more, at the time when the indicator was developed, you already had several agencies that were collecting data, reporting on fossil fuel subsidies, both on the consumption and the production side. So that included the International Agency, the International Energy Agency, the IMF, the OECD, as well as some national or regional data sets that were sometimes produced, usually not in a systematic manner, but that could come from, for example, the ADB, or also some countries like Italy and India and Egypt would be fairly regularly monitoring subsidies, but always in the case of all these different reporting, it was always with pretty wide differences in scope, in availability, with definitions that would differ. So, for example, definitions of subsidies for national reporting were usually a bit more narrow than those used internationally. And so, as a result, we ended up with figures that could not be completely comparable. And so that was definitely something to address in order to improve this monitoring process. So a little bit maybe about the role of UNEP in all this. So you might know that IGES for this indicator. That makes us responsible for providing guidance to UN member countries on how to report on the indicator 12C1. So the indicator itself, actually the target itself is to rationalize the emissions of the fuel subsidies. And the indicator, sorry, is the amount of fossil fuel subsidies per unit of GDP. And so when this target, the rationalization of fossil fuel subsidies was adopted as part of the SDG framework in 2015 and the related indicator in 2017. So there was no, as I explained previously, there was no internationally agreed methodology for the measure of fossil fuel subsidies. We had different agencies using different methodologies, and that was therefore the first step that was required to make it possible, and that led to the development of this methodology that you see here on the right side of the screen, in cooperation with IISD as well as with the OECD to produce these internationally agreed methodology. A little bit about the steps regarding the development of the methodology itself. So that went through extensive country consultation, some pilot testing in 3 countries, Egypt, India, and Zambia. That led to the draft methodology paper at the end of 2017. And this methodology was then reviewed by an expert groups. There was extensive consultation with statistical communities. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cold as well. Ultimately, this methodology was then endorsed by the UN Committee of Experts on Environmental Economic Accounting and by the Interagency Expert Group on SDG indicators. So by the end of 2019, by the beginning of 2019, we finally had a formally approved methodology. So in 2019, this indicator was reclassified as a tier 2. So to tell you a bit more about that, the UN Statistical Department differentiates 3 tiers of indicators. So tier 3 refers to indicators that have no international established methodology or standards, which was the case until now for fossil fuel subsidies measure. And moving to tier 2 meant that we had a methodology that was conceptually clear, internationally agreed. So with standards available, but with data that is not regularly yet produced by countries. So that was already a progress, but obviously the objective is to ultimately reach the level of tier 1, which is when at least 50% of countries and of the population in every region report on this indicator. So since 2019, the reporting of this indicator is still being done using estimates that are produced by previously existing international sources, so the IES, the IMS, and the OECD. Now, in 2022, or to be absolutely precise, at the very end of 2021, UNEP launched the data draft for this indicator directly from countries. The initial deadline was in March, but then we actually slightly extended it to June for the first round to give countries a bit more time. The data is now being reviewed by UNEP with support from IISD, and it will then be reviewed once again by the UN Statistical Department. And so this is just to show you the fairly long process that goes from developing a formally international agreed methodology, having a database built on international sources, which will then, and that's now the process we're in, be progressively replaced by national data sources as countries progressively start reporting on this, which will realistically take a few years because it is a long process, but which is now starting to accelerate. Now, one of the questions is who actually reports on this indicator? National statistical offices are usually the lead for data reporting on SDG across governments. But in the case of this, in the case of fossil fuel subsidies, data sources are actually quite diverse. We know that fossil fuel subsidies occur in different forms, and as a result, there are quite large differences between countries in terms of data availability, in terms of data sources, it means that collecting this data requires to pull together information from a fairly large number of actors. Usually they're spread across different ministries, and that really can hinder the data collection process because it requires, well, quite a bit of intergovernmental coordination. So again, even though the statistical offices are usually our focal points for the reporting on the data, it's likely that they will need support not only from one, but from several other ministries, starting with the Ministry of Finance, who will have all the information, for example, on the tax data, but also from other sectoral ministries like the energy ministries, trade ministries. It could be even agricultural ministries if there are some specific schemes supporting, the use of gasoline for farmers, for example, just a very specific example. But that's just to give you an idea of how broad the involvement can be. Also here, I would mention the one example of a country that we came across, which I think is quite interesting in how they approach this issue. So following a training that was delivered by UNEP and IISD, and also after receiving, I think, additional support from the OECD, Costa Rica actually created a national team which brought together all the relevant institutions with the objectives of this task force being that they would agree on the common approach for the collection of data and the reporting on the indicator. They agreed on common definitions and all of that in order to have a statistical process and instruments in place to track the indicator, but also ultimately to agree on mechanisms for decision making, including the formulation of decisions related to fossil fuel subsidies, which again is really what we want to aim for. And I think it's worth mentioning because it's a really successful example of how a country can mobilize and create its own internal process and develop a form of ownership of this data and fossil fuel subsidies. and use this opportunity, this indicator reporting, as a way to initiate an internal national dialogue, because ultimately, again, tracking is very important, but it's the means to a bigger end. Now, regarding the evolution and way forward on the reporting on this indicator, so UNEP has been with support for IISD, from IISD and from other partners such as OECD or IEA. UNEP has been supporting capacity building efforts, such as trainings in country, like regional trainings, to try and disseminate this methodology and make it a bit more accessible to the relevant stakeholders. In regards to the reporting itself, as of now, actually, I think these numbers have changed in the last 2 days, but 5 countries have reported fully on this indicator in the first round. 4 countries have reported, but reported no subsidies, which is something we need to look a bit more closely at. And a few more countries asked for a deadline extension because they are currently in the process of collecting this data, but it is indeed a fairly time-consuming process, and therefore they felt like they wouldn't be able to report until the end of the year, which is obviously completely fine, and we can provide support if needed. So it's a small start, but it's definitely a start, and with additional support from partners like IISD and other agencies, we're really hoping that by 2025, the idea that we will have this tier 1 indicator with a reliable, comparable national inventory and fossil fuel subsidies, and not have to rely only on these international sources. I'll try to be very quick because I think I'm getting over time, but this is just a quick presentation, a quick introduction to the SDG 12 Hub, which is a platform on which SDG 12 C1 data submitted by countries will be reported after it's been reviewed by UNEP and by UNSC. So the SDG 12, if you don't know, that relates to sustainable consumption and production. So that's the hub for all the sub-indicators of this SDG, not only 12 C1. So that includes indicators relating to food waste, efficient use of natural resources, sustainable public procurement. It's a pretty broad topic. There are many others that I won't go into, but to give you just a sense of what it will look like. So at this stage, similar to the fossil fuel tracker that Lucas was presenting, which I really strongly encourage you to check because it's such a really amazing tool. At this stage, we're still using international data sources, so IEA, OECD, IMF, but this is where we will progressively replace this data with national inventory. And hopefully by 2025, the goal is to have a pretty complete overview of fossil fuel subsidies at national level. I think that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask. I'm happy to also share links to the methodology that was referred and to take any other questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for providing us a very interesting presentation, especially focusing on 12C1 and focusing on what subsidies as part of SDG indicator. Now we have a few minutes for question and answers. We already had a few questions by the audience, and those have been already answered by the panelists, and I really want to thank the panelists for trying to save time by answering. But since there are 3 specific questions, I would like to see if Joachim or Dr. Kojima would like to give any additional information on those. And if not, then I would move to a few other questions which I have for the speakers. So let me just turn to Joachim first. Joachim, would you like to have any additional, share any additional information on the questions you answered?
No, nothing additional. There was just one question on whether there were any studies on the impacts of the Ukraine crisis on fossil fuel subsidies. I think Lourdes is also very well placed to answer, and Claire as well. But BPT team, we haven't really looked at this extensively, but this is something we plan to do more in the next phase of BPT in the context of different crises. But I just shared there the EU Repower Plan and the IE 10-point plan, because they indicate roadmaps to reduce energy use and diversify energy supply. So in line with the crisis context and for fossil subsidies, I think we're going to expect higher numbers, but we don't have yet the estimates. But maybe Lourdes, if you wanted to come in here, or Claire as well.
Should I start briefly? I mean,
Yeah,
well,
please.
as Joachim says, so I mean, there are no concrete studies yet, apart from, well, different initiatives by the EU, etc. But to be honest, I mean, in general, subsidies, they are not necessarily response to, I mean, if we look at fossil fuel subsidies, obviously, so there are two types, the consumption ones, which actually they're mostly a response to the prices, the consumer prices due to the increase of international price. And that's what, well, we are expecting to see, but also, I mean, I think many countries, we know that they have implemented measures that can mostly cash transfers, reduction of the price of gasoline and diesel at the pump, etc. Also reduction on gas prices for heating. We saw the winter, so there have been many measures in that aspect. And then it's also the production side. I mean, that is definitely a direct response to the crisis, because several countries are getting back or sometimes releasing bans that they had on the production of fossil fuels, or even like giving eventually additional incentives, so that's yeah, that can be promoted the production. Again, these subsidies to fossil fuels are very dangerous, because they risk to kind of, well, keep locked our systems based on fossil fuels. And again, it's a very tricky situation. Of course, energy prices are going up, and of course that has a tremendous negative social and economic impact, but it's also the opportunity to kind of accelerate the transition. There have been discussions for years now on the transition, and this is a very good moment. And that's the EU plan that Joachim was sharing in the chat is actually a good example of that. So yeah, more to come, but to say that increase is there, but it's an opportunity to move towards, I mean, to accelerate the transition towards renewables.
Thank you, Lourdes and Joachim, for answering those and for sharing additional views. And I would like to thank Dr. Kojima for highlighting that the RCES, the CES initiative in Japan, is definitely, it's actually been happening in several countries. So specifically, the question was to see if there is any developed countries are having any initiative on CES. Do you have any additional information to share, Dr. Kojima?
Thank you very much. Good question. Yeah, currently, at least like we IGES are focusing on like Asian countries, not the developed countries, basically, like middle developing countries or developing countries, like India, Indonesia, Bhutan, etc., etc. So yeah, so far, but at least this, so we established CS, so Circulating and Ecological Sphere Asia Consortium, together with SMART, which is the, if I correctly remember, it's a US-based like institution. So we have some interest from other developed countries as well. And then in addition to my reply to the question, so as I mentioned, so we are engaged in this consortium, which is a consortium of research institutes in each country. But in addition, now we are just together with Asia Pacific Network for the Research, APN. We are conducting some like national workshop in Thailand. So far, we have organized webinar in Philippines, and we plan to have either webinar or workshop in Thailand, Vietnam later to promote this circulating ecological sphere concept to like policy makers or like municipality officers in addition to like researchers. So we are doing this kind of follow-up activity as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kojima. And we have one question to Claire, and this is from an anonymous attendee. This question is, would you like to elaborate how those data from countries is being cross-checked So Claire, would you like to answer this?
Yes, thank you. Well, as it says, so I assume that refers to submissions from country data. So at this stage, this cross-checking is mostly to go through each of the reported subsidies and compare that with the methodology, making sure that it aligns with this very extensive and well-detailed methodology. Obviously, if we also find very large discrepancies between assessments, estimates that were produced by other sources, such as the OCG inventory, for example, and the data reported by countries, is something that we may as well flag to them. And once those discrepancies or potential methodological issues have been detected, we would send back to the country for review of their own internal data. I hope that's clear enough.
Thank you so much.
Also ask,
yeah,
apologies.
Please.
I should also ask that as this is the first round of reporting, this is also something that we are progressively, this is a process that we are progressively developing and improving as we go on a learning basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. And now let me turn to Joachim. There's one question which talks about, could carbon removal and CCS technology serve a path to avoid negative social impacts in developing countries? So I'm sure probably it may be some example or information from the and answer this question. Would you like to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there were two parts. So definitely one part about whether it's responsible to remove fossil fuel subsidies for local populations on the consumer side. And then the other part, as you say, on CCS and whether that could be a solution. I think, well, for the first one, it's a very good point. We definitely don't want to remove, a fossil fuel subsidy without any social protection. But from the analysis we've done from the Inequality Party dashboard and also in line with other analysis, untargeted, fossil fuel subsidies such as reductions of fuel prices at the pump or a VAT price freeze or other measures, they're not pro-poor in the sense that they will actually tend to benefit more higher income consumers that consume more fuels. And there's also a risk once these measures are in place that they're difficult to reverse because they create a sort of expectation that the subsidy should last. And so there may be more interesting to think of other support schemes where the money could be reinvested with more social benefits in this way. I mean, just one example of heat pumps that may be costly initially, but with government incentives that can reduce costs more in the long run. But it could, beyond the energy sector, you could think of other social support schemes. So I think from our standpoint, it's understandable that there would be this, there's definitely, we do not want to remove the subsidies without any sort of social protection, but we're not convinced that untargeted fossil fuel subsidies are the best way socially to protect consumers. And the second point about CCS, I think, is a good question. In my view, it comes down to an opportunity cost. CCS is still quite costly, and these carbon removal technologies may not, in our view, be the best way to invest the money. It may be more a better solution to actually use money to invest in renewables and other solutions to reduce emissions. And I think while it is interesting and understandable in countries that produce more fossil fuels, while we've seen some of these measures in Canada or different countries in the EPT, and definitely there's a environmental conditionality to it, but at the same time, it still doesn't change the problem of increasing fossil fuel production. So it doesn't really tackle the problem at its root cause, and there may be better ways to, again, just transition or other solutions, which is another whole debate. But yeah, I don't know if that fully answers. I realize it's a complicated question with a lot of implications. But yeah, if others on the call also have suggestions, they're very welcome to come in.
Thank you, Joachim. And I'll quickly go to Lucas. He has raised a hand. Lucas, do you like to share any information or something?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So just to pivot back on what Joachim said, in the EPT, we also saw from everything that's CCS, carbon removal technologies, all the investments are from what we could consider developed countries. So there's also no really investment from developing countries in these technologies. And then in the second part, the question for Dr. Kojima, regarding, so you mentioned this AI study, right, for the Japanese kind of policy direction, either going to decentralized or a sustainable centralized area. I was just wondering what was the centralized area or sustainability centralized area also considered, or are there also programs on this project, or was it agreed by the government that the focus should be on decentralized? And then the second layer to my question, how was the population's involvement and especially the acceptances of these programs? Thank you.
Thank you, Lucas. Probably in view of that delay that happened in the beginning, so we could probably take an additional 5 minutes or something. So, Dr. Kojima, would you like to quickly answer that?
Okay, yeah, thank you very much for your good question. Yeah. So actually, yes. So actually, in this AI-based simulation study, there are many drivers, and then one of the drivers is either government policy goes to more urbanization approach or like a more decentralized approach. So then basically, so urbanization is not creating like sustainable centralized areas, just whether it's more urbanized society or like decentralized society, along with of course other many drivers as well. And then, but among these drivers, so this decision about urbanization or decentralization was identified as the most, I'll say, crucial like decision factor. So this is, yeah, actually what this study says. Thank you very much. Is it okay?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kojima. And so we are sort of taking 1 minute extra. I think we have already had a late start, but I think I would like to conclude the session now. And so we had a few questions and few very good questions, and we also had a very good discussion by all the panelists. And I would like to thank all the panelists as well as attendees for your patience, and despite that delay encountered in the beginning, you all actually have done a wonderful job. So I would like to thank all of you, and once again, my apologies on behalf of the organizing team for the technical which we had in the beginning. Thank you again, and let's stay in touch. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you
Thank you very
everyone.
much.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.